conversation with me, David Speers, which I think does give us licence to cover quite a bit of ground. The PM years, the current geopolitical scene, and perhaps everything in between. Would you all please welcome the former Prime Minister, Kevin Rudd. Who is also the current president of the Asia Society Policy Institute. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon.
Good to be back in the nation's capital, David.
Indeed. Look, you know this room well. You've addressed the National Press Club.
It's looking
many times.
flashier than when I was last here.
It's looking good. This will be a little bit different, a conversation, and I may jump around a fair bit in the timeline here from your period as PM and the years since. Look, before we get to any of that though, Tim Fischer, I am keen for a reflection on this. There have been some beautiful tributes over the last 24 hours or so. I wanted to ask you though about your decision to appoint Tim Fischer as Ambassador to the Holy See and the conversation you had with him around that appointment. Why you thought the boy from Boree Creek would make a good ambassador?
Well, Tim Fischer stands out, I think, in the national imagination. Obviously, I'm not of the National Party, although most of my family in Queensland are and were. I'm the red sheep in the family. But there's something about Tim which just caused him to sit out from the norm. And there was a significant element of human decency to him, which, as you know, can be lost in our national political fight. Second reason was being a practising rock chopper helped, Roman Catholic, if you're sending someone to the Holy See. And thirdly, because it was the first time we were going to appoint a resident ambassador there, my judgment was to take the politics out of it. It'd be far better to have someone from the other side. And so then I rang him up in Boree Creek and said, "G'day, how are you?" I said, "Prime Minister, how are you?" He said, "To what do I owe the honour?" I said, "Your country needs you." And he said, "Kevin, that's bullshit." Conversation proceeded from there, and I said, "Look, this is what I'm proposing to do. Pope Benedict XVI is coming out here. I think it was World Youth Day, actually, in 2008. And I think this would be a good thing to do. It's the only G20 country without a resident ambassador in the Holy See. And there's a bunch of stuff we need to do. One is I'm interested in religious freedom in China and Vietnam, and the Holy See is active in those questions. 2, the Holy See is active in global aid policy. And 3, starting to become active on climate. And so these are the reasons I'd like to have someone there." So, "You're it, comrade." And he said, "Rome." I said, "Yeah, that's where the Holy See is." And I said, "And it has limited train lines." And then he said, "No, they do have a train." Only Tim Fischer would have known that. But the decency of the bloke was along these lines, that he said, "I need to talk to my family." Yeah. He said, "Here is our challenge." And I don't think I'm saying anything out of school, which is not already on the public record. That Harrison has autism, and I want to make sure that were we in Rome, that there'd be the services to support him. I said, "Okay, mate, take as long as you like, except the Pope's coming." And so sorted out by then. And so he literally came back a day or two before Benedict arrived and said, "We'd be honoured." And in Rome, I've got to say, he was just this sort of larger-than-life figure. I went off to see the Pope because I was in Italy for some other purposes as Prime Minister. When you go to see the Pope, it's like this pageantry of a medieval court. There's these Swiss guards and all this gear, all carrying their axes and halberds and God knows whatever else. And you're in procession with about 15 to 20 people. All the Australian officials were giggling because they couldn't handle this. Except Tim was there with his akubra. And there he was at the top of the procession. Everyone else was dressed in basically 18th century admiral's uniforms and white tie and colours and God knows whatever else. But there was the boy from Boree Creek in his akubra, and the Pope knew him straight away. "Tim," he said, "good to see you." So I think he really cut an image in Rome. And what was generous about him, any Australian school group which went through Rome, he would make a time to see them at the centre of St Peter's Square there. So be there at 12 and I'll take you on the guided tour. And so he's that sort of guy. So I think the nation is poorer for his passing.
No, indeed, indeed. And well said. Look, I want to turn to a different diplomatic relationship, the one that dominates our everyday conversation these days, whether that's in the media, whether it's in politics.
Ooh, I'll get in trouble for that.
Almost. But it does. Academia, business. China is just all we seem to talk about every day at the moment. What I think is missing, or perhaps a little confused in the debate, is this question of what does China, and perhaps more specifically, what does Xi Jinping want? I mean, does he want global domination? Does he want more control regionally? Does he just want to see China's economic growth continue? Is it as simple as that? Now,
He's certainly got his eyes on Queanbeyan.
Right. You have been involved in a research project at Oxford University, is that right, on Xi Jinping and his worldview.
Yeah.
So what is it?
Well...
in 30 seconds?
30 seconds. Give me a minute and a half.
Okay.
I'll just try. As best I understand it. Like, he doesn't send me an email and say, "Dear Kevin, here's my worldview." It's something you've got to work at. But let me put it in just to 6 or 7 quick points. Number one, if you're sitting around the table of the Standing Committee of the Politburo, number one on your core set of priorities, your mission statement is keep the Communist Party in power. We often forget that. Don't. It's a Leninist party and it doesn't intend to lose power. And this is an authoritarian party which won power through the barrel of a gun and intends to retain power, if necessary, through the barrel of a gun. Number two, national unity. And that's where Xinjiang, Tibet and Taiwan come second in the Communist Party's set of priorities, including Hong Kong. And that is, in Chinese history and in current politics, anyone who is seen internally as letting loose any element of the kingdom, frankly, is written off in Chinese history and is on the way out in terms of Chinese politics. 3, grow the economy so that not just living standards are rising and poverty being reduced, but rebuilding the legitimacy of the Communist Party in the eyes of the Chinese people, which had been shredded during the Cultural Revolution. But now doing it with a much greater degree of difficulty with environmental sustainability, because people want clean water, they want clean air, they want food that doesn't poison you, just like anywhere else in the world. Number 4, and you'll be pleased to know there's only 6 or 7 of these. 4 is, but it's important to try and understand the hierarchy of needs here. Number 4 is neighbouring states. There's 14 of them that share land borders with China, and about 6 or 7 who have contested maritime boundaries. And what China wants is to ensure that its neighbouring states are as benign and ultimately as compliant as possible. A huge amount of work, for example, has gone into Russia in the last 10 years to turn Russia from being a strategic adversary into what is now today virtually a de facto ally once again. 5, push the Americans out of East Asia and the West Pacific to what they call the second island chain. If you drew a line down from the Japanese archipelago through Guam down to the Philippines, that's what China sees as its natural maritime environment. Of course, it's directly relevant to one day using military force to regain Taiwan. 6, second last, going to the west, its western perimeter, cause Eurasia to become a strong and central economic partner for China in the future to further grow the Chinese economy, hence the Belt and Road Initiative all the way to Western Europe. And lastly, incrementally, bit by bit, change the global rules-based order to make it more compatible over time, gradually, with Chinese values and Chinese interests. Not a sudden shock, but that's it. So I have found it useful to have that sort of as it were, framework for understanding where Chinese actions on a given day
Well,
fit.
I think this is really interesting, particularly, the first 3 or 4 there are all very domestic-focused priorities. The top priorities are very domestic. Look, there's long been an assumption that once incomes reached a certain level in China, that we would see this push for political liberalisation become inevitable. John Howard recently expressed the view that that's no longer his assumption, that we have really, under Xi Jinping, seen quite the opposite. We've seen stricter state control, and I think, as you noted in a speech to the West Point Military Academy, a reassertion of Marxist and Leninist ideology. Is that what's happening? Should we give up on the prospect of liberalisation in China?
In terms of political liberalisation, I've never been of the view that whatever engagement of China meant as a strategy by the US or the rest of the collective West, that was going to transform the Chinese Communist Party. I've never really had that view. I mean, I've lived there, I've worked there, I've studied Chinese, I've been in and out of the country for 35 years or more now. And so, but today, further acting against that possibility, you now have the formidable armoury of the Chinese surveillance state, and its ability, therefore, to continue political control domestically, which, frankly, previous generations of authoritarians around the world would have dreamed of, but are only now available. And you know what I'm talking about in terms of facial recognition technologies and the rest. So I think, in their mind, the Chinese Communist Party's mind, they believe that the party is sustainable for the long term. And further, this is where it gets really interesting, they also believe that our Western democratic project may not be sustainable for the long term for the rest of us, given Trump's America, given the problems of European democracies, given populism, and given the totality of, let's call it, dysfunctionalities that we see in so many of the Western political systems at present. So they see themselves, despite all their internal problems, and there are many, as sitting on a reasonable glide path to the future. May not be one that I agree with, but I'm just being descriptive here of how they view it.
When we look at the trade war right now between the US and China, how much is that hurting China right now? Where do you see this going? Scott Morrison, I think just this week, said we're stuck with this for a long time. Is that your view, and how can it be solved?
Look, I'm in a minority of people in the United States. The think tank I run is New York-based, and we have a network around the world. I'm in the minority by saying I still believe this thing can be done. It'll be an untidy deal, but the reason is as follows. The fundamental economic interests of both presidents require them to reach an outcome. China's economy domestically is weakening for a range of factors, one of which is its domestic economic policy settings way before the trade war began to bite on Chinese growth levels. And so as of last year, early part of last year, when I was in and out of China, Chinese entrepreneurs, captains of industry, telling me that growth was on the slide, fixed capital investment on the slide, a diminution of private sector business confidence, and then the trade war. So for growth to fall much below 6% domestically in China causes the party to become very fearful about the future of employment stability and social stability, and therefore political stability. So in a normal
it's
world...
getting pretty close to that.
Yeah, it's actually, the published figures are around 6, but if you dig down into the provinces, actually you find that it's considerably softer than that right now. And so for those kind of aggregate reasons, I think the Chinese leadership would like to get a deal done, because it's just one extra huge piece of lead in the saddlebag.
Would they give much ground, do you think?
I think they can do a bit. Trump, because the economy is weakening there, and you've seen all the data, you've seen what's happened with recent moves and the inversion of the bond rate.
Yield curve.
And the yield curve, but also the fact that the monetary policy instruments are virtually exhausted. And the growth cycle there, the business cycle, is already 10 years and pretty mature, and they are due to start heading south into a recession. But he's got to get re-elected next year, and no president easily gets re-elected in the middle of a recession. So therefore, the question is the architecture of the deal look, there are 3 or 4 major issues of contention. I think if you're looking at it rationally, you can find a way through that. It'll be an untidy deal, it'll be a dirty deal. If it's to be done, it'll be done by Thanksgiving, so the end of November this year.
Well, this is affecting all of us right now, as is the strategic tension between the two. Let's turn to Australia's relationship with China. It's had its ups and downs. I remember being in Beijing when you were addressing the Peking University. I think Misha Schubert, Mark Kenny in the audience were there in the room as well. We were trying to work out what you were saying because you delivered this speech in Mandarin. You had some rather...
So are the Chinese.
Yeah, well, perhaps. You had some rather pointed observations to make about China's approach to Tibet that weren't particularly well received at the time. But we did have some other issues in the relationship then as well, with Australian businessmen being detained and so on. But it strikes me we've really been put in the freezer more recently, in the couple of years since Malcolm Turnbull introduced the foreign interference laws. We haven't had an Australian leader allowed to visit China. Ministers have barely been able to go on a few rare occasions. What's happening right now in the relationship?
Yeah, I think there's the freezer treatment is being applied. To backtrack a little bit, to be fair to this government, the Morrison government, the Australia-China relationship has always been difficult. It's been a challenge, just to be fair about it. I mean, for those of you who did observe our management of that relationship at the time, we brought down a defence white paper which defined China as representing a strategic challenge in East Asia for the future. That hadn't been done before. We took early decisions on Huawei in relation to the NBN. They were not popular. We rejected a number of critical Chinese foreign investment applications, the Australian resources industry, human rights, you've mentioned those, Xinjiang, as well as Stern Hu and his treatment in the legal process. So it was not a bed of roses, but we did maintain a balanced relationship. I think what has really caused this one to come unstuck is what I describe as Malcolm Turnbull's quite egregious decision to deliver that strange and curious speech or statement at the end of 2017, where he said the Australian people have finally stood up against the Chinese threat. And then he tried to render it in Chinese. Do you remember the speech? In Chinese, he said, and now, that was a direct parody of what Mao said on the podium of Tiananmen Square on the 1st of October 1949, proclaiming the establishment of the People's Republic, when he said the Chinese people have stood up after 100 years of foreign oppression. And so you could not pick a single phrase to be more offensive to every element of the Chinese political culture than that one. But as we know, Malcolm always thought he knew best about everything. Everything. And so I was in Beijing when he did it. And just the general jaw-dropping on the part of everybody who had anything to do with the Australia-China relationship, and central leaders with whom I was meeting at the time.
And is that what we're still paying the price for now?
I believe so.
Right.
Because that was one of those definitional moments in politics, international relations, when, frankly, the whole Chinese nation stopped and said, what the hell is this? Now, building on top of that, you've had, I think, a series of, what I describe as excessive reds under the bed yellow perilism from various conservative members of Parliament, Hastie being the most recent one, which basically take an already complex and difficult relationship and get a whole bunch of petrol and say, there's a nice big flame, whack, let's throw it on top of that. Boom, oh, it blew up. How unusual. So what I'm saying is, dealing with the structural complexities of this Australia-China relationship, egregious language in dealing with a very proud political culture does not help solve or manage the fundamental problems of the relationship.
I mean, look, clearly some of Andrew Hastie's own colleagues agree with the point you're just making there, that he went too far in the language. But this is the debate right now. Should we be calling out what China's doing more openly? Should the Australian people understand the efforts it's making in influence, whether it's in academia, business or whatever, here in Australia? How do we handle this?
Well, I believe you can walk and chew gum at the same time, as I've said for more than a decade now in the Australia-China relationship. What I used to do with Chinese leaders, including with Xi Jinping, is be very blunt in private conversation and where necessary publicly about two things. We're an ally of the United States. That's not going to change. Just like Trump. It's going to be there. Why? Because of historical reasons, but also, frankly, and I explain this to Chinese leaders, if you're 25 million people sitting on a large piece of real estate in our part of the world, and there's a very large country with whom you share basic values and a commonality of interest in most things, an alliance makes some historical and future sense. So I said to the Chinese leaders, comrades, that's not going to change. Number two, we're a proud liberal democracy. We have a completely different view of human rights to what you have. And guess what? That's not going to change. Third point is, now, within those parameters, what can we do together? And that, I think, is a basic architectural setting for this relationship, which the current Conservative government seems to have lost sight of.
But do you agree the Turnbull government was right to push back at Chinese foreign interference with those laws, and since then with calling out when China is trying to interfere in Australia?
I think the foreign interference laws, as amended, and they were subject of a lot of bipartisan work involving the Labor Party here in Parliament at the time, I think ended up with the right balance. But we've got to ask ourselves this question: how did it all come about? Because the mad Conservatives in this country had rejected legislation drafted by myself and Faulkner back in 2008, 9 and 10 to ban all foreign donations to Australian political parties. So how did this, as it were, crisis unfold? Because Turnbull, it was Turnbull actually then as Leader of the Opposition, who rejected our draft legislation at the time in the Senate to ban any donation to Australian political parties which was foreign sourced. That would have, frankly, taken a lot of this difficulty away. Not all of it, a lot of it. So all I'm saying is there are real issues here about the sovereignty of our democracy. We have to be defending of it in terms of cyber, in terms of political donations and other forms of influence. But let us not turn this into neo-McCarthyism. It is very dangerous for those of us who have a vague memory of what McCarthyism was like. It's very easy to slide into what I describe as a little bit of national hysteria. It's possible to manage a balanced relationship between the US and China within those parameters that I talked about before, while managing evolving challenges as they arise without screaming it every second Thursday morning from the rooftop.
Just to pick up, because the comments you've just made there are interesting, I'm sure journalists will be keen to just drill down a little on that. Are you saying we are sliding into national hysteria, McCarthyism, when it comes to China?
There's nothing new in what I've said about the dangers of McCarthyism or neo-McCarthyism.
Is that what's happening now, though?
Look, I live in the United States. I am not here on a regular basis, but when Chinese Australians come up to me and say that they are copping abuse in the streets, and when American Chinese say the same to me as well, we have to be very careful about how we manage these debates. It's very easy to slide in that particular direction. We've mentioned both Turnbull and Hastie. Let me just make one other cautionary point. The Liberal Party has a very bad history of using core foreign policy questions for domestic political gain or internal party management. If I look at young Hastie, who I've never met in my life, by the way, I've just seen him on television, I'm always cautious about post-pubescent politicians who decide that the best way, or pre-pubescent in his case, I'm not sure, the best way to make a name for yourself within the raging beast of Australian conservatism is to whack the Chinese on the head, again, every second Thursday, and find the biggest and best grab in order to do that. Hastie himself, correct me if I'm wrong, having earlier accepted a donation from one of the most controversial Chinese that we're talking about, Huang Xiangmo.
He returned that.
He may have returned that, but he took it, okay? And he returned it, I presume, after everything became a matter of public record. All I'm saying is, when Turnbull, in order to deal with domestic challenges within the Liberal Party, decides to go all hairy-chested on China, the Australian people have finally stood up, and you've got Hastie doing the same. There is a more balanced and rational way through managing what is a difficult relationship, a complex relationship, than turning it into a page one headline for the Murdoch media the next morning.
Let me ask you about Scott Morrison's approach on China. It strikes me he is trying to be more measured than some in his approach. And today, of course, he's in Vietnam. Obviously, there's trade and economic opportunities there that we need to further, but there's no denying, everyone knows there's a great strategic reason for being there as well. Vietnam is engaged in some pretty, high-stakes tension at the moment with China over the disputed waters around the Straddle Islands.
It's been going on for 1,000 years.
Yeah, exactly. So is Scott Morrison right to be in Vietnam today? And is his approach more generally to building deeper strategic relationships with countries in the region a good approach?
Well, firstly, what I'd say about Prime Minister Morrison is that I think, unlike his predecessor, he understands, I think, the need to develop a balanced relationship with the People's Republic of China. And there's a number of things he has said, a number of things he's done, which to me suggest that's what he's trying to do. Secondly, I think consistent with that, he's also seeking to bolster Australian bilateral relationships in Southeast Asia. And I think it's a good thing he's in Vietnam. I had a very good relationship with the Vietnamese leadership. We hosted them here many occasions in Canberra. I used to work with them intensely on questions of the regional political architecture. How do you get the Americans to stay in? We did that a lot, both above the radar and below the radar. But one thing I'd say, given you've raised the Prime Minister's name, that I'd really caution the country about is, what the hell are we doing in the South Pacific? The posture on climate change by this government, again driven by domestic politics within the Conservative parties, is disastrous for our interests in the South Pacific. We all know the reasons why. It is axiomatic for our Pacific Island brothers that the world acts on climate change, and we are leading that action. We, the Australian Labor government that I led, had a first-class working relationship with every country in the Pacific except then the military dictatorship in Fiji. And then secondly, we had aid levels rolling out to every Pacific country, which were going like that. We renegotiated our Pacific Partnership agreements with every single Pacific Island country, and we treated our brothers and sisters in the region with respect. That, in the last 6 years, has gone out the door backwards and created a massive strategic opportunity for China. And you've seen that even yesterday with the statement out of the Chinese Foreign Ministry about Australia's behaviour on climate, most recently in Tuvalu.
But is there an irony in the fact that China, yes, it's trying to build influence in the Pacific, but it's certainly not spending the amount of aid money that we are, and it's not doing as much on climate change, arguably, as we are?
Well, what China does on climate change is fundamental for all of us. The fact that President Obama was able to secure Xi Jinping's agreement to sign up to the Paris Agreement, Paris Treaty, on climate change was an achievement in itself. China has, in the last 12 months, embarked upon an emissions trading scheme, albeit at this stage confined to the power generation sector. If you look at the growth of China's renewable energy, it's proceeding at a pace more rapid than is occurring here, notwithstanding the renewable energy target we legislated back in 2009. And so there are actions being taken by China which prior to that were not there. Do they need to do more? Yes. But we leave a wide open diplomatic goal by simply being missing in action on this question. And by the part of all these states with whom we have had an umbilical relationship for 30 or 40 years under previous governments, both Labor and Conservative. And now I begin to see this fracturing. It is a deep national security error by this government.
Look, we've probably spent more than 30 seconds on China, to be fair, so perhaps we'll move on.
It's a big country.
Let's turn to the wonderful democracy of Australia. In your book, in fact, the PM Years, Chapter 1 is titled "The Coup That Killed Australian Politics." You really began the book at the ending, I suppose, of your Prime Ministership. This was the first coup...
I did come back.
You did come back, true. Which...
There was a resurrection.
There was a resurrection.
And then another death.
it was another in a series of coups, of leadership changes that we've seen over the past decade. Look, there is a bit of a view that perhaps we've come to the end of it now. Perhaps now Scott Morrison, having won this election, no longer having Tony Abbott, Malcolm Turnbull in the party room, with the rule changes that followed your rule changes in the Labor Party, with opinion polls perhaps not being treated as seriously today, that we might be past this decade of coup culture. What do you think?
I hope so. I'm not sure that Peter Dutton agrees, but I hope so. Hi, Dutto. Just sending him a cheerio. The thing that I needed to do to stabilise politics on our side was the rule change of 2013. And it was my precondition for returning to the leadership. I had to negotiate this beforehand. I said, if you don't do this, I'm not doing it. And I remember after Albo and I became Prime Minister and Deputy Prime Minister, a number of the Bobber boys in Labor parties came up to me and said, you know that thing about the rule change, why don't we do it after the election? I said, when you expect me to be dead? No, we're doing it now while I'm still well and truly alive. Which is why we had a special caucus meeting, the Balmain City Hall from memory, Town Hall, and passed it. And since then, we have had leadership stability on our side of the shop. Of course, the Tories thought, because they're of superior breeding to the rest of us, that they didn't need anything like that. And then we've just had this litany of executions as the tumbril has rolled to the guillotine every second Thursday in the Tory party rooms. Until Morrison realised they needed the Rudd rule as well. So all I can say is, thank God, because any serving Prime Minister should have an opportunity to lead his or her government with a basic assurance of political stability from their own team, rather than running the gauntlet of the fortnightly terrorism strikes of Newspoll, which basically say, in, out, up, down, you're about to be killed, off you go, how do you feel, leadership change next Wednesday or not? And I think that's brought some stability.
Yeah, and look, I think many would share your view that hopefully we have seen an end to that. That coup in particular, though, and I remember covering it, as many in the room may as well, you've gone through this in quite a lot of detail in the book.
Yeah, I was there.
You were there. And look, some quite choice descriptions of those who wronged you. Stephen Conroy, a sad man, always tormented by his inner demons. Don Farrell, the living embodiment of small man syndrome. Wayne Swan, a weak man not up to the job as Treasurer. Was it good to get this off the chest?
Your problem with any of those descriptions?
Not for me to judge, but was it helpful to get all this down on paper?
I think these are quite mild compared with what was used in relation to myself over many years. I mean, this book was only written at the end of last year. And what my political detractors in the Labor Party sought to do was rapidly go into print as soon as the government lost in the 2013 election, establish a narrative, and then to implant it as deeply as they could in the body politic. I didn't. I had other things to do, and I thought it was best to leave a fair bit of water pass under the bridge. But can I just say this, that the overall argument that I put forward in the book is pretty simply this. One, the coup was not about high political purpose. It was just about basic political ambition. It was just Shakespearean. They wanted to be in a more powerful position. And the coup supporters, the narrow group of factional leaders, all got promoted. Second argument in the book is, having done so, they had no plan whatsoever about how to fight and win the next election, which was the 2010 election. None whatsoever. And the third was this: having scrambled home with a minority government, they had no plan for government. That's the core argument put forward in the book. The counter-narrative you're familiar with, which is, you know, Rudd was going to lose the 2010 election because he had lost one news poll. We'd been ahead in 4 years in news poll, but we lost one news poll, 51-49. The second argument they put forward was that Rudd had lost his marbles and had effectively a breakdown. That's what Julia Gillard said. And that thirdly, it was, quote, in the national interest for them to move in. So what the book does with 1,400 footnotes is disassemble that argument for the load of codswallop that it is, and simply set the record straight. That's what I've done, and it's over.
Let me ask you about policy, because, I mean, some of the criticism internally was also about the policy. You tried to do a lot, which is what I want to ask you about. Not all of it worked. There were problems with asylum seekers and the mining tax, CPRS and so on. But you also tried to do the National Disability Insurance Scheme, the NBN, a whole new hospital funding deal and so on. What I wanted to ask you was, did you try and do too much? And when you look at Scott Morrison, who went to the election with not a big policy agenda, and the Australian people backed him in, what does that say about whether leaders should measure how much they're prepared to do?
I think when you're the Prime Minister of this country, you've always got to be ready for the exocet, which comes from nowhere. In our case, the exocet was the global financial crisis. And the result of that was we had two jobs, two full-time jobs at once. One was managing this crisis, which no one had predicted, which threatened the fabric of the financial system and collapse, and the risk of a national recession and possibly second depression. These are not dramatic statements, these are contemporaneous from the authorities at the time. That's huge. We didn't expect that. Then over here you've got your pre-election agenda, which you've committed solemnly to the Australian people that you're going to implement. And so you've got to get on with, remember, the buck stops with me in terms of the National Health and Hospital System. That's why I was committed to doing National Health and Hospital reform. We said we would evolve a National Disability Insurance Scheme. We said we'd legislate for the Fair Work Act. We said we'd bring in paid parental leave. We said we'd lift pensioners, age pensioners, out of poverty by the biggest single adjustment to the age pension. We did all those things. I think, as I say in that book, the benefit of 2020 hindsight, once we came through the crisis, and that was really not until the very end of 2009 and into early 2010, I could have fronted to the nation and said, you know something, because of this near-death experience, the Australian economy, we need to take a breather and have more time to deliver our pre-election commitments. Of course, had I done that, you and everyone else would have held me down for using the excuses provided by a globally soft economy for not implementing our pre-election commitments. In other words, just another typical politician. So I was mindful of that. So what did I do? I worked 48 hours a day rather than 24. And as a consequence, we did try to do too much. I accept that.
Do you think, though, today, looking at how Scott Morrison won, is there now a reluctance to broach big ideas, take on big reforms? Do you see things have changed?
I think the Conservatives, for a long time in Australia, have had a simple view of politics, which is to win an election, it is about anxiety and fear based around questions of identity and race and economic insecurity. And it's not just here in Australia. I see the same in the United States. I see the same in most countries in Europe as well. And that has proven to be an effective political strategy for the conservative right in all these countries. The only problem is it doesn't give you a platform or a strategy for government. That's the problem. I think Mr. Morrison's challenge is going to be this. There is a real risk this country will face a recession next year. A real risk. I don't seek to talk the economy down. I'm simply reflecting where the mainstream debate is in the United States and parts of Europe right now about the softness of the global growth numbers. And so the real question for Mr. Morrison and his government now is to reflect carefully on those conditions which existed at the time of the last financial crisis and the lessons to be learned from that. For example, then we had fiscal room to move, to be fair to the previous Conservative government prior to us. Monetary policy room to move, interest rates were then at 7%. We also had machinery to move collectively across the world, the G20, which I was instrumental in creating. And we also had a government, which I was leading, determined to act counter-cyclically. So if these global factors are brought to bear on Australia, trade war and other factors, as we move into 2020, we've got to ask ourselves, what is now different? And this is a question for Mr. Morrison. The fiscal room to move is now limited. Monetary policy settings, we now have interest rates at historically low levels. Therefore, the opportunity to stimulate the economy by further interest rate cuts is now virtually shot. Thirdly, we also have a fractured G20 and an American leadership which is not providing coordinated economic leadership like the second Bush administration and like the Obama administration, because they both straddled the crisis. And what I see most worryingly is a predisposition on the part of this Morrison government to regard any form of stimulus as unclean, politically unclean, when in fact the lesson of economic history is if this thing is going to come and knock you over from external forces, you must act, or otherwise you throw the country into a very deep recession. So I think that for Mr. Morrison, my strong suggestion would be, together with the Reserve Bank, start thinking through new approaches for dealing with a possible recession. New approaches from the Reserve Bank in terms of operating off the Reserve Bank to provide transfer payments to the community if necessary. Infrastructure investment, which the RBA has already recommended, but the Morrison government's rejected. But also using your bilaterals with the Americans to try, as Morrison goes to Washington next month, to shake this administration out of its infatuation with protectionism, which is lethal for our global economy.
Okay, but just on that, the government would argue it is spending a lot on infrastructure. It would say that now is the time to bring the budget back to surplus, given the conditions. If we don't do it now, when are we going to do it? Are you saying we should be prepared to throw that surplus and stimulate with more spending?
All I'm saying is that you should be alert to emerging economic circumstances. When I campaigned in the 2007 election as an economic and fiscal conservative, I meant it. That's how I was brought up. That's the work I'd done in the Goss government in Queensland, and that's my every instinct. However, when you face a major unanticipated external economic threat, which will throw 500,000 people out of work, hundreds of thousands of small businesses into insolvency, are you just going to sit there and say the surplus is sacred? Or are you going to take the advice of your senior mandarins, in my case Ken Henry and the rest of the Council of Economic Advisors, and said, Prime Minister, you must take this budget into deficit and you must stimulate the economy, otherwise the consequences will be disastrous for the nation at large. Have that intellectual flexibility is all I'm saying as you approach the uncertain, choppy waters of next year.
Well, that brings us to Labor's approach in this year's election. Put simply, why did Labor lose?
Oh. Well, I campaigned in about 12 seats. And so I was here for a couple of weeks and I saw and felt a fair bit of what was happening on the ground. So I wasn't just looking at it from the vantage point of a foreign observer. And that's always dangerous. It's always easy to be an armchair strategist in politics. But I think if we're being blunt and about why we didn't prevail, I think there is probably three reasons. One is, rightly or wrongly, the Australian people didn't warm to Bill. They didn't particularly like him and they didn't trust him. Rightly or wrongly, I say. That was what I encountered from voters. Number two, it is unwise, in my view, as an opposition, to recommend complex changes to tax and retirement income for the simple reason it's too difficult to explain from opposition and is easily turned into a fear campaign by the Conservatives. And the third is the Murdoch media. And the Murdoch media ran the most biased anti-Labor campaign, I think, in the country's history. If I was to count up the daily newspaper coverage out of the Australian and all the state tabloids, this was a 95-5 anti-Labor bias in the news coverage and editorial coverage. I read every day's papers when I was here and when I was back in the country. In fact, I tweeted about it almost every day because it was so outrageous. So can you blame them, however, uniquely for Labor's loss? No. But was that part of the equation? Absolutely, because they set the parameters and the tone for the conversation, including through the electronic media.
Let's unpick some of what you said there. The first issue you raised there was Bill Shorten. Rightly or wrongly, people didn't trust him or like him. You were picking that up in the electorate.
I think every candidate was.
Right. But clearly he'd been leader for quite some time. He'd been opposition leader for quite some time. Was there anything that could have been done about that? I mean, is that something a leader can fix?
No. Some of the caucus colleagues said to me, well, bugger you, Kevin, for bringing in the rule and
right.
to provide us with all this...
they were keen to change.
All this stability. Well, from time to time they were thinking about it. But I think that's where you require senior leadership within the party after a certain period of time to say to the leader, we should think this through.
So you think they should have looked at changing leaders?
I won't go that far because I wasn't here. I just wasn't here. And it's wrong for me to, unpick this from afar. But all I'm saying is that was one of three factors, in my judgment, which led to the political outcome which very few people anticipated.
And the second point you raised there was don't try and tackle big tax in retirement changes, franking credits and so on, from opposition. Only do that in government. Doesn't that inevitably mean small targets from here on in?
No, because if you look at 07, no one could accuse the platform I took for the 07 election as being a small target strategy. It was a very big target strategy. It was full of big policy ideas.
But a lot of them were big tax cuts, but matching Howard's tax cuts.
No, but hang on. Ratifying Kyoto, 20% renewable energy target, emissions trading scheme, National Health and Hospitals Reform Commission, network, NDIS, the rest. This was a very big policy agenda, but I've been around long enough in politics to know what the Conservatives are capable of doing with misrepresenting even modest changes on tax and retirement income. They turn it into the fear campaign of mother of all fear campaigns. And remember the billboard right across the country, which the Liberal Party ran, about we can't afford this bill. And that was a fear campaign based on their rendition of the changes to tax and super. So I believe you can run a big campaign with big policy ideas. And for God's sake, here we are in 2019. This nation is in desperate need of a vision for its future. A vision for its future. I mean, our economy cannot be sustained the way it is.
And I want to come to...
And the same with our relationship with countries in the region and what we do on climate. We have to think big, in my view, for the future. But that doesn't mean committing cardinal tactical errors in an election campaign.
Did you feel this way during the campaign? I mean, we saw you and Julia Gillard reunited, cheering on at the...
Happy families.
Was it happy families?
Next question.
Refer to the book page. But you were there cheering
Solidarity forever.
Cheering on Bill Shorten at the campaign launch. Paul Keating post-election has made a similar point that Labor misunderstood Middle Australia. You seem to be making the point, don't go to things like franking credits during an election campaign. Should you have spoken up during the campaign, before the election?
Of course not. I mean, I'm not the leader. I mean, it'd be quite professionally improper.
Did you talk to anyone privately about this?
Private conversations are private conversations. But it's quite improper to engage in a public debate of that type. There's another factor, by the way, which we've skipped over, and I've skipped over in my response to you as well, which is the People's Republic of Queensland, where I come from. We're not all mad up there. We're just a bit different, okay? And frankly, to win nationally, I say this to my friends, colleagues and comrades in the Labor Party and Labor movement, you must win in Queensland. 2 Prime Ministers since the war have won either a majority or more than a majority of seats in Queensland. One's R.J. Hawke, God bless his soul, a great Labor Prime Minister, and myself. It's hard. It's not just Brisbane, it's wider southeast Queensland, and each of those provincial cities is different. And until we understand the deeply decentralised nature of Queensland and how, therefore, to campaign for an economy which is not only about resources, but is deeply and profoundly a small business state, and one with certain religious sensibilities, you can't just ignore that. You can't just disparage it. You've got to work with it. We did.
Yeah,
and we prevailed.
Was the Labor position on coal and climate change a problem in Queensland?
I think there was a great danger of being, as many have said, of being neither Arthur nor Martha on this question. I think the bottom line is, though, more profoundly on the question of climate change, policy and politics, about which I have been passionate ever since I entered the Australian Parliament, is we should never find ourselves defined in terms of the appropriateness or otherwise of our climate change strategy by what the Green Party says. Okay? The Green Party has no interest in becoming the government of Australia. It's a permanent opposition. Boutique opposition, where its principal objective is to bleed votes off the Labor Party. The Labor Party has an aspiration to be the government of the country. But for them to define the Labor Party's climate change credentials simply in terms of Adani, I think was a profound political error. And secondly, without responding that, were it not for the Green Party, we'd now be 10 years into an emissions trading scheme in this country. Because the Green Party sided with the Liberal Party twice to defeat our carbon pricing system in the Australian Senate. Let not the nation forget that.
What then is your advice to Anthony Albanese, not only about winning back seats in Queensland, which is crucial if he's to have any chance, but more generally?
I think in Queensland, folk actually like Albo. I mean, I know he's from, quote, the Sydney left, but I've known this guy for a long time. And the thing that Albo has as a strength, fundamental strength for himself in politics, is that he is who he is. It's authentically him. That's it. There's no particular gloss to it. And frankly, though I would be seen as somewhat nerdy compared with Albo, I was just who I was.
I was going to ask you about this.
So, you're just who you are. And you don't try and be something else.
Right.
So Albo's got one big strength going for him there. He is who he is. Secondly, the guy is deeply economically literate. The guy's an economics grad from Sydney. He understands the economy. He ran the entire infrastructure program for our government, did it enormously effectively. And, that's why he's weighed in on this debate in response to the Reserve Bank governor, which is the country now needs to invest more in infrastructure, not just for infrastructure needs, but to ensure that the economy stays out of recession.
But forget the franking credit, the negative gearing, the tax change. Don't try and do that from opposition.
Yeah, I just think that's nuts.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm just think it's absolutely nuts.
On the authenticity point...
See, what they wanted to do to me in 2007, when Costello and Howard thought they were very clever, and most Tories do think they're very clever, because that's in their training, or in their breeding, or both. And so, whack, you remember this, they brought in this huge set of tax cuts about 2 days into the election campaign in 2007, and they wanted us desperately to come out and say, we'd have this bit but not that bit, this bit but not that bit, in order to have an entire election campaign about tax. So my response was, nah, fine, off we go. All I did was take off a slice at the top for the wealthiest Australians and dedicate that to Computers in Schools program, which actually, despite the rolling attacks by the Murdoch media, was effectively delivered.
On authenticity, you talk about Anthony Albanese's authenticity. Look, this is a very important currency in politics, and people spot a fake and hate a fake. Your authenticity, I mean, when we look at how popular leaders have been, and you touched on Bill Shorten's problems in that regard this year, but in 2007, you were very popular. This was the Kevin 07 campaign. You did quirky...
That was not my idea, by the way.
Right, okay.
That's why it worked. It wasn't my idea.
Right. But you did do some quirky and even dorky things that you would put up online and embrace, and it was really trying to show who you were, I suppose, in many ways. And nowadays, you're the self-declared king of handball as well. For those who've not been on social media and seen any of this, give it a go. What's this all about?
Handball? It's a game in 4 squares.
Right.
I spent my entire life looking for a sport I could excel in, and failed all the way through. No, actually, it's a very simple story to this. I was at Brisbane State High School, and I was going off as Foreign Minister to give a speech to the Assembly. It's a huge school in my electorate in Brizzy. And I arrived early, unusual for me. And the kids on the handball court said, "Come on, Rudster, in you come." And so I said, "OK, good." I hadn't played this since I was at school. And so they stuck it up on social media. Then it went viral. And then there's a whole culture out there, men and women of Australia, of handballers across this country. There are hundreds of thousands of them who love this stuff. And so they've kind of adopted me as their patron. And so I put out a simple tweet the other day, because they've been writing in saying, "Can you send us out a handball signed?" I said, "Fine." So I offered this on Twitter the other day. You know how many responses we got? 9,500 free handballs from me. And by the way, your Murdoch mob then attacked me for not providing free postage, which I would have then handed on to the taxpayer. Think about that, you guys.
All right. Let me finish on a more serious note. One of the other things you famously did was offer the apology to the stolen generation, an historic moment. We've now got this debate around constitutional recognition. You strongly support it, and the idea of the voice to Parliament being enshrined in the Constitution. Look, Prime Minister Morrison has made it pretty clear that's not something he wants in the Constitution. Politically, how would you get this done if you were in power today?
Given the polarisation that's happened here, I'm the first to recognise it's hard. I suppose what I'd ask Prime Minister Morrison to think about is just this. You know, politics is a hard business. You don't know how long you're going to be there. You just don't. There's exocets waiting for everybody in this business, and I've referred to some of those we had to deal with. But I'd say to Mr Morrison, however long you were here, think carefully about how you remembered and how you defined. In the whole sweep of things, this is not all that hard. The critique from the far right that an Indigenous voice represents a de facto third chamber of the Australian Parliament is just bullshit. It's just bullshit. And the reason is the Senate and the House of Representatives legislate. The proposed voice does not. It is advisory. That's the difference. And so when Dutton and the rest of the far-right nutjobs go around there and describe this as a third chamber, it is a lie, a bald-faced lie. And so what I'd say to Mr Morrison, having been so non-partisan in my previous remarks just now, is ignore Dutton. Define your own legacy. And this can be part of it. To get this done could be done well by a Conservative government. And, you know, use Abbott, use me, use anybody who's previously been Prime Minister to go and fashion a consensus with Indigenous Australians and with the other constituencies in this country and bring something forward which can work for Indigenous people first and foremost, but also for the community at large. Let us get this behind us and done so that we can have constitutional recognition of our First Peoples. It ain't all that hard, folks. And Mr Morrison, I think, would be well remembered in Australian political history if he could do this.
Is that an offer from you to team up with other former PMs and try and get this done?
I would even work with Abbott. But I'm almost confident Abbott wouldn't work with me. But I would certainly work with him. And frankly, in a completely non-partisan way, to just try and find the landing point for this. I do not believe this is all that hard. And it will require some leadership by ScoMo, though, to negotiate the right-wing fringe of his own political movement. But you know something? You get these things done, you look back a year later and you say, why did we think that was so hard? I fully anticipated a massive racist reaction across the country when I did the apology. I thought that's what was going to happen. And many of the right-wing bother boys in our party said, "Oh, mate, you know this apology stuff? Woo! Wouldn't go near it if I were you so early." So we did it. So I was braced, and guess what? The nation came with us. The nation will come with us on this too. if we can just take a deep breath, suspend normal political position taking, and find a way through. And I'd be the first one to congratulate Scott Morrison if he did it.
Well, Kevin, I know you've probably got a zip, so would you please thank the former Prime Minister for being with us for this conversation over the last hour. Thank you very much. Thank you, mate. That was really good. Just, look,